Greetings, history buffs and knowledge seekers. Welcome back to Old News, the Year in Review podcast that revisits the stories that made headlines and the moments that defined our world. I am your host, Andrew Van Timmeren. We live in an age of information overload, but sometimes taking a step back and revisiting the past is the only way to understand the present. Today we're stepping into 1940, another incredibly pivotal time in history. If 1939 was the spark, 1940 was the year the house caught fire. For months, the world had lived through the phony war, a strange period of anticipation where very little happened on the ground. But that silence was shattered in April 1940 with the Norwegian campaign. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway to secure iron ore shipments and naval bases. The Allied response was a logistical disaster, and the failure to protect Norway triggered a political earthquake in London. The debate over appeasement, the policy of making concessions with Hitler to avoid war, had reached a breaking point. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the man who famously promised peace for our time, was facing a mutiny. In the historic Norway debate in Parliament, even his own party turned on him. The choice for a successor came down to two men. Lord Halifax, the quintessential diplomat who many believed would seek a negotiated peace with Hitler, and Winston Churchill, the aggressive, cigar-chomping outcast who spent a decade warning that Hitler could not be reasoned with. Lord Halifax, known as the Holy Fox, was the ultimate establishment figure. He was calm, deeply religious, and favored by both King George VI and the Conservative Party elite. He was a man of the treaty and looked at the map of Europe, seeing a logical necessity for a negotiated peace. He believed that by using Mussolini as a mediator, Britain could strike a deal with Hitler to save the British Empire from total destruction. To Halifax, Churchill was a rogue, volatile, reckless, and far too fond of the smell of gunpowder. But Halifax had a problem. He was a member of the House of Lords, which meant he could not sit in the House of Commons. In a time of total war, he felt it would be a disastrous handicap to lead the country from a separate chamber where he couldn't directly debate the people's representatives. Furthermore, Halifax lacked the stomach for the sheer brutality of a total war. He famously admitted that the thought of the premiership gave him a physical headache. Lord Halifax ultimately stepped aside, and on May 10, 1940, the very day Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries, Churchill became Prime Minister. This wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a total shift in philosophy. While Halifax would have sought a rational settlement to preserve what was left, Churchill viewed the conflict through a different lens. To him, there was no rational deal to be made with a totalitarian monster. That decision wasn't easy. It was rumored that even Churchill considered a peace treaty in the face of near insurmountable odds. But in the end, he chose defiance over diplomacy, famously declaring in the first of many carefully written and eloquent speeches as PM, that Britain would fight back, and offering his blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Several good books on this. But the German Blitzkrieg tore through the Ardennes and bypassed the impregnable Maginot Line, the Great Wall of France, once considered to be the most advanced defensive system in the world. So Churchill made several desperate trips to France to bolster their resolve. In these tense discussions, he was shocked to find the French High Command already contemplating defeat. He even proposed a declaration of union, a radical plan to merge Britain and France into a single nation to keep them in the war. But the French government, led by those favoring an armistice, rejected it. Sensing an easy victory and fearing he would miss out on the spoils of war, fellow fascist Benito Mussolini finally brought Italy into the northern conflict, declaring war on a mortally wounded France and Great Britain. This stab in the back, as President Roosevelt called it, expanded the war into the Mediterranean and North Africa, where Mussolini hoped to forge a new Roman Empire. By late May, the British Army had been trapped against the English Channel. This led to Operation Dynamo, the desperate evacuation from the beaches of Dunkirk. It was a moment when the line between military and civilian life blurred. A flotilla of over 800 little ships, privately owned fishing vessels, pleasure yachts, and lifeboats, crossed the channel to rescue their boys. Against all odds, they saved over 330,000 soldiers. Churchill used this moment not to celebrate a victory, but to galvanize the nation, delivering his most iconic speech. "We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." By June, after France fell, Hitler planned to invade Britain in Operation Sea Lion, but first needed to destroy the Royal Air Force, RAF, to control the skies. The German Luftwaffe, the world's most powerful air force at the time, launched massive waves of attacks, first targeting shipping and radar stations, then RAF airfields, and finally London itself in what became known as the Blitz. The British were enduring nightly bombing raids, and gas masks became a part of daily life. But the shift to bombing London was a critical German miscalculation, as it gave the battered RAF time to recover. Britain's forces were vastly outnumbered, but were able to replenish their arms quickly, had skilled fighters, and another secret weapon, radar, and the chain-home network of early warning stations along the English coast, which allowed the RAF to detect incoming enemy aircraft long before they reached British shores. Going into the conflict, the Nazis were very confident in success, just as they had over the rest of Europe. Hitler couldn't believe that Britain was not surrendering, clearly underestimating their resiliency. And on September 15, the RAF inflicted devastating losses on the Luftwaffe. And 2 days later, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. The battle was a turning point of the entire war. It proved Germany could be beaten and kept Britain in the fight. A lesson here is war is brutal. War is brutal. There are no guarantees of success, and countries will fight back hard to protect their sovereignty. But the Nazis also had other ideas. In the Reich Security Office, they were launching a far more subtle and potentially devastating assault on the British Empire, Operation Andreas, which later evolved into the infamous Operation Bernhardt. The goal was simple yet catastrophic: hyperinflation. By flooding the global market with near-perfect counterfeit British pounds, the Nazi aimed to destroy the credibility of the Bank of England and trigger a total collapse of the British economy. To do it, they turned to a slave labor workshop of over 140 Jewish concentration camp prisoners, master engravers and printers who were kept alive only as long as their forgeries remained flawless. These men lived a harrowing paradox, giving privileged rations while knowing they were walking dead men, scheduled for execution to bury the secret the moment the presses stopped. This operation was the starting plot of the 2026 movie Peaky Blinders, The Immortal Man. Good movie. The counterfeit production part was accurate, but how notes were introduced into circulation is where actual history and the movie plot deviate. The original plan was to rain money from the sky, but by the time it was ready, Germany had lost air superiority over Britain. So the SS launched a global laundry service. Using a network of spies and black market hubs in Switzerland and Italy, they washed the fake notes into genuine gold and raw war materials. The infiltration was so successful that by the end of the war, nearly 1 out of every 10 British pounds in circulation was a Nazi forgery. Even the infamous spy Cicero, who stole British secrets from the embassy in Ankara in 1943, was paid in these Bernhard notes, discovering only after the war that his treason gold was actually worthless paper. British intelligence had a spy in the German government who warned them about the plot. So to combat it, they quickly forced the Bank of England to recall and redesign its entire currency system, withdrawing all notes with a face value of £10 and above, leaving the white fiver the only high-value note left in circulation. It was so effective that these 10 to 50 pound notes wouldn't return to British pockets until 20 to 40 years later. The plot also faced an internal resistance. The Jewish prisoners engaged in a dangerous game of deliberate sabotage. When ordered to crack the US $100 bill, they intentionally stalled, faking technical errors to delay the project until the Reich collapsed. In the final days of 1945, the Nazis scrambled to hide the evidence, dumping millions of counterfeit currency into the 300-foot depths of Lake Teplitz in the Austrian Alps. And the stall worked. American troops found and liberated almost all of the Jewish foragers, malnourished but alive. Meanwhile, in the east, Japan was solidifying its own footprint and fundamentally changing the geography of the war. While the world's eyes were often glued to the Blitzkrieg in Europe, Japan was already 3 years into a brutal full-scale invasion of China, a conflict known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. By 1940, Japan occupied most of the major Chinese coastal cities, but they were struggling to land a knockout blow against the Chinese resistance led by Chiang Kai-shek. To choke off the supplies reaching the Chinese interior, Japan looked south. In September of 1940, taking advantage of the fact that France had been crippled by Germany, Japanese forces moved into the northern French Indochina, what we know today as Vietnam. This wasn't just a local skirmish, it was a move that directly threatened British and American interests in Southeast Asia, particularly the rubber and oil supplies that the global economy depended on. This aggressive expansion was officially codified in Berlin. There, representatives of Japan joined Germany and Italy by all signing the Tripartite Pact, officially forming the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo Axis. This was a mutual defense treaty specifically designed to intimidate the United States. It sent a clear message to Washington. If you attack any one of us, you are at war with all of us. For the first time in history, the world was truly divided into two massive armed camps, and the Pacific was no longer a distant theater. It was becoming the second front of a global war. The signing of this pact is a chilling reminder of how regional conflicts can rapidly develop into a worldwide struggle, and a theme that remains incredibly relevant in our modern era of complex international alliances. And the Soviet Union in 1940 was playing an opportunistic double game, neither allied nor enemy, but actively expanding under the cover of its 1939 non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Stalin used the chaos of the European war to aggressively grow Soviet territory. Finland was attacked in late 1939 and forced in March 1940 to surrender the strategically vital Karelian Isthmus. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were annexed outright in August. Romania was pressured into ceding Bessarabia and northern Bukovina that same summer. Meanwhile, the USSR was economically fueling the Nazi war machine, shipping millions of tons of oil, grain, and raw materials to Germany under a February 1940 trade pact, meaning Soviet resources were effectively supporting the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain. Britain and France were in the awkward position of being technically at peace, with a country actively supplying their enemy. The Soviets were also making headlines elsewhere. In August, Leon Trotsky, the founder of the Red Army and a brilliant orator who believed in permanent revolution, was assassinated. He was the only living figure with the moral authority to challenge Stalin's legitimacy as Lenin's true heir. Having already airbrushed Trotsky out of historical photographs and official textbooks, sounds like the photos in the White House in 2025, Stalin sought his physical erasure in a fortified villa in Mexico. The hit was carried out by NKVD, Soviet Secret Police, agent Ramon Mercader, who spent months infiltrating Trotsky's inner circle by posing as a sympathetic, non-political businessman. On the day of the attack, he entered Trotsky's study under the guise of presenting a manuscript. As the aging revolutionary began to read, Mercader struck him in the skull with a concealed mountaineering ice axe. Trotsky died the following day, signaling to the world that the strongman reach of the Kremlin was borderless and absolute. By silencing the last original voice of the 1917 revolution, Stalin effectively unified the Soviet state under a single unchallenged will. That September was also full of pivotal actions in the United States. On the 2nd, President Roosevelt signed the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, under which the U.S. gave Britain more than 50 obsolete destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on territory to be used as U.S. air and naval bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean, including Antigua, Bermuda, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Trinidad in the British West Indies. Roosevelt framed this as a defensive win for the U.S., arguing that bases protecting the eastern seaboard and the Panama Canal were in America's natural interest. keeping any potential enemy far from U.S. continental limits. Then 2 days later, fearing such moves would drag the U.S. into the European War, the America First Committee was founded. The group remained firm in its belief that Nazi Germany posed no military threat to the U.S. itself, so AFC leaders promoted four stated principles. The U.S. must build an impregnable defense. No foreign power could successfully attack a prepared America. American democracy could only be preserved by staying out of the European war. And aid short of war threatened to involve America in war abroad. And 2 days after that, on September 6, while the U.S. remained officially neutral, the government took its first steps toward mobilization by enacting the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. This was a move that many considered electoral suicide by President FDR, just 7 weeks before the election. This landmark legislation required all men between ages 21 and 35 to register for military service. It was a massive gamble. Roosevelt was asking millions of young men to prepare for a war he was simultaneously promising to keep them out of. The political stakes were incredibly high, but the tension was eased by an unexpected act of statesmanship. Roosevelt's Republican opponent, Wendell Willkie, charismatic corporate lawyer, refused to turn the draft into a political club. Instead of attacking the dictatorial nature of a peacetime draft to win votes, Willkie supported it, knowing that a defenseless America was a greater threat than a third-term presidency, which FDR was seeking, breaking the two-term tradition set by George Washington. Willkie hammered Roosevelt on the dictatorial implications of a third term, warning that if one man was indispensable, then democracy was already in danger. But even with this support, the country remained deeply divided. When the time came to extend the draft in 1941, it passed the House of Representatives by just a single vote. But because of this risky 1940 gamble, over 1 million Americans were already in uniform when Pearl Harbor was attacked, preventing the U.S. military from having to start from absolute zero when they declared war in response. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's decision to run also led to fighting a civil war within his own party over his vice president. His sitting VP, John Nance, Cactus Jack Garner, was so appalled by the break with Washington's two-term precedent that he actually challenged FDR for the nomination. The two hadn't seen eye to eye for years. The conservative Texan Gardner famously described the vice presidency as not worth a bucket of warm spit, sensing that the coming war required an ideological soulmate rather than a political rival. FDR issued a brutal ultimatum to the Democratic Convention. He would only run if they accepted his Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace, as his new VP. Wallace was a brilliant, eccentric intellectual and a staunch New Dealer, but the party establishment loathed him, viewing him as a mystic and far too radical. In the final days of the campaign, Roosevelt famously and perhaps misleadingly promised American parents, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." Just over a year later, Pearl Harbor would render that promise impossible to keep. In the end, of course, FDR won, 449 to 82. This 1940 VP swap was a pivot point in history, but it set the stage for an even more consequential change. By 1944, as FDR's health visibly declined, party leaders became terrified that the radical Wallace was only a heartbeat away from the presidency. In a smoke-filled room in the Chicago Convention, they successfully pressured a fading Roosevelt to dump Wallace in favor of a relatively obscure senator from Missouri, Harry S. Truman. It's a staggering what-if of history. If not for those two ruthless VP swaps, the first to get rid of the conservative Garner in 40, then to oust the radical Wallace in 44, a completely different man would have been sitting in the Oval Office when the time came to decide the fate of the atomic bomb and the shape of the Cold War. Let's now talk innovation, which didn't stop for the war. It accelerated. 1940 saw the critical race for the design of a new military vehicle. The Bantam Car Company delivered the first Blitz buggy prototype to the U.S. Army in September, proving that a small, rugged four-wheel drive vehicle could handle the demands of modern combat. This was the birth of the Jeep. And in the skies, Igor Sikorsky performed the first successful flight of the VS-300, the first practical single-rotor helicopter. Another breakthrough in radar technology was the cavity magnetron. British scientists brought a prototype to the US in a black box in 1940. It was so powerful it made miniaturized radar possible, fitting it into planes. And eventually it's what powers your microwave oven today. Fashion in Britain, 1940, saw the rise of the siren suit, a one-piece jumpsuit famously worn by Churchill, designed to be zipped on quickly over pajamas when the air raid sirens went off. In the US, the zoot suit was gaining traction in jazz subcultures, but the looming war meant a slimming down of silhouettes to save fabric. In medicine, Sir Howard Florey, Sir Ernest Boris Chain, and Alexander Fleming successfully isolated and tested penicillin on mice, proving the drug could fight systemic infection. A breakthrough that would soon save millions of lives and would earn them the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. And in the world of sports and culture, the mood was a mix of nostalgia and transition. In baseball, the legendary Lou Gehrig was forced into retirement by the disease that now bears his name, ending his Iron Man streak of 2,130 consecutive games. On the silver screen, Disney released Pinocchio and Fantasia, pushing the boundaries of animation and sound. Meanwhile, Charlie Chaplin released The Great Dictator, using satire to directly challenge the rise of fascism. A bold move in an era where many in Hollywood were still hesitant to provoke international conflict. Even the way we consume music evolved as the Billboard Music Popularity Chart debuted in July, forever changing how we track cultural trends. And on radios, Edward R. Murrow began his This is London broadcasts. The sound of real bombs exploding in the background of his radio reports brought the war into American living rooms for the first time. 1940 was a year of reckoning. It was the moment when the old world order truly collapsed and the arsenal of democracy began to stir. It serves as a stark reminder that even when things seem at their darkest, innovation and collective will can change the course of history. Thanks for tuning in to Old News. As paraphrased by Winston Churchill, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Stay tuned, you're getting more knowledgeable with each episode.